Your Excellency, the Ambassador of Colombia to Kenya, Elizabeth Teloja, Your Excellency, the High Commissioner of Australia to Kenya, Alison Chatter, the Chief Guest, Mr. Walters Mongara, distinguished young diplomats, respectable colleagues, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. It is a great honor to be here this morning to address you. And what I want you to do at this moment is to turn to the person seated beside you and tell that person that I am Africa's now and not just Africa's tomorrow or Africa's future. Please do that. Good, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is the young trees that makes up the forest. In the context of this discussion today, during these young diplomats of Kenya Third Conference, this African proverb tells us one thing, that Africa's transformation cannot be accomplished without the youth. You seated before us here today, together with colleagues across the continent and the entire globe, represents not just the solutions that are needed to address the challenges that are plaguing human beings, but you are the tip of the spear that will tear down the challenges that are plaguing the entire world today, whether they are challenges of food insecurity, whether they are challenges of malnutrition, or challenges of climate change. You represent those solutions, and you, the youth, currently constituting the majority of the African continent today, over 60% of the African population is youthful. And right here in Kenya, 70% of the population of Kenya is youthful. And in 17 years from today, youth reaching working age in the African continent will exceed the rest of the world, will exceed the rest of the globe combined and continue for the rest of the century. The message is simple. Africa's youth can no longer be a footnote in the chronicles of development. The message is simple, that Africa youth and the global youthful population today can no longer be a statistic that is endlessly quoted. It is time for Africa youth to arise and be heard. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, when you take the case of Africa today, in an Africa where 240 million people go to bed hungry, and over 50% of mothers are burying their kids before they reach the age of 5 due to malnutrition, you, the Kenyan youth, must join compatriots across the entire continent and the world and be heard in driving solutions that will eradicate the shame of hunger that is long overdue. In an Africa today, where economic productivity is up to 20 times lower than that of developed countries, the Kenyan youth must join compatriots across the entire continent today and the world and be heard in building world-creating enterprises and industries. In an African where annual post-harvest losses, as we're speaking today, are costing the continent $48 billion every year, forcing the continent to import food worth $35 billion every year. This means the import bill is over 10 million each year. You, the Kenyan youth, must join compatriots across the entire continent and the world and be heard in creating competitive enterprises along the entire agro-value chain that will turn these losses into jobs and income opportunities. In an Africa where 12 million youth each and every year get into the labor market, competing for just 3 million jobs each year, with the unlucky ones risking their lives crossing the Mediterranean Sea and some burying themselves under the Mediterranean Sea, as well as millions crossing the Sahara Desert and being sold into slavery. The youth must be heard in creating economic opportunities right here in the African soil. In an Africa where climate change is no longer an abstract issue. Climate change is no longer an abstract issue. It is already redefining the contours of this continent more dramatically than any other. As we're speaking today, millions of people, whether in the Sahel, right to the Horn of Africa and down to the savannas of southern Africa, are suffering either drought or flood. displacing millions and seeking sanctuaries in places not their own. With all this, it is time not just to talk about it, but it's time to do something, and you, the youth, have the solutions to do so. Distinguished young diplomats, ladies and gentlemen, under the changing climate, diplomacy aimed at ensuring Kenya's and indeed Africa's response to the changing climate must be in the context of driving socio-economic transformation. But socio-economic transformation that can actually result to accelerating development and lifting those from the bottom of the pyramid to the top. And this is the fierce urgency of now. In this discussion today, it is this kind of diplomacy that will build lasting peace, with which you should focus on. In the context of Kenya, we call it diplomacy for climate action and the Big Four. It is your responsibility as young diplomats to shape this strategic approach to diplomacy. This is the kind of leadership that will entrust you as a youth to be at the forefront, to be front center in Africa's now, and taking the baton not only to shape the world tomorrow, but also into the future. It will elevate you from being relegated as leaders of tomorrow to holding a stake right now in driving Africa's socio-economic transformation and Africa's rise to prosperity. But for this to happen, allow me to discuss the tenets that are actually needed to guide you in this kind of diplomacy. First, at the core, Africa is a continent that is vulnerable to the changing climate today. It's already impacting sectors that are fundamental to driving socio-economic transformation and lifting those from the bottom of the pyramid and making sure that we can have inclusive growth. But Africa is also a continent that has shown light to the world. Africa, when it comes to the changing climate, despite the fact that they've contributed least to the changing climate today, is also providing solutions. When you take the Paris Climate Change Agreement, which was adopted by 197 member states across the world in December 2015, this Paris Climate Change Agreement has been mostly ratified by many African countries today. Africa is the region that have most ratified the Paris Agreement. In this global compact in responding to climate change, 80% of countries in the continent have ratified this because they've seen the inherent opportunities that are actually in this Paris Climate Change Agreement. With Kenya being part of the countries that have actually ratified this, they are doing this in the context of accelerating socio-economic transformation. And what this is telling us is that as you foster ahead in not only reshaping your diplomatic skills, but in focusing in what can be able to drive transformational change in ways never ever seen before. What is happening in this agreement is that two sectors, the clean energy and nature-based agriculture, which are capable of accelerating socioeconomic transformation while also ensuring that our ecosystems, our forests, our waters continue to flow, are actually captured in this. And in April 2016, African ministers of environment coming together under the banner of the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment actually concluded on the need to be able to ensure that development is not in silos, that utilizing clean energy to add value to agricultural production should be done so to ensure that we drive a sustainable agricultural-led agro-industrialization powered by clean energy. This is the way that we can be able to reverse the $68 billion that has been lost as a result of ecological degradation. This is the only way that we can be able to reverse the $48 billion that is lost as a result of post-harvest losses. And when you dovetail this right down to Kenya here, Kenya is losing $500 million every year as a result of post-harvest losses. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, this is an opportunity that we can be able to tap into. It is an opportunity that can be able to create up to 17 million jobs when these synergies are actually linked, whether it is clean energy, linked with information communication technology, and with other logistical aspects like financial services. All these provide enough opportunities to forestall water-related conflicts. All these also provide an opportunity to ensure that the pollinators responsible for 70% of our food remain intact, that our soils remain healthy so our farmers can reap optimally from their farms to ensure adequate food for all, to forestall hunger-related conflicts. This is what is called Africa's catalytic sectors. And right here in Kenya, when you take Makueni County, application of minimum tillage is not only resulting to yields over 300%, but at the same time is providing additional benefits to farmers. The list goes on and on. This means that you should be able to foster an opportunity within your diplomatic skills to weave into what the continent has in abundance and to bring reality to the problems and challenges that have been faced today. The second is building on this point of ensuring that synergistic and complementary approaches, utilizing what we have, 65% of uncultivated arable land, abundant clean energy, 365 days a year, only received in this continent, provides an opportunity to add value to what is produced to curtail the post-harvest losses. And building on this second point is the African Union Agenda 2063, which is the continental blueprint to creating the Africa we want, underscore the need to sustainably industrialize the continent, leveraging on clean energy as the path to building the economically inclusive, environmentally sustainable pathway to creating truly the Africa we want, one where opportunities are for all, not for a chosen few. Under the changing climate today, that is urgent, and this is the only way that we can forestall conflicts. When you weave these to the Sustainable Development Goals, we intend to leave no one behind. This becomes critical high-level policy tools that you have in driving this novel paradigm of diplomacy. And the third tenet is just about 3 months ago, 44 countries across the African continent signed the landmark African Continental Free Trade Area. This actually was a realization of the dreams of the founding father that fought for self-determined rule. This African Continental Free Trade Area provides an opportunity not only to consolidate a 1.2 billion market in the continent today, but also consolidate up to about 3.4 trillion US dollars worth of continental GDP into one market, which is built as the largest trade and stands to provide a market that will fuel the rise of clean agro-industries in the continent, and also forms a foundation against climate vulnerability. Kenya is in record, has set the record as the first country to ratify this landmark, showing a shining example for the entire continent to follow. In 12 years from today, 43% of all African countries are projected to join the ranks of the global middle and upper classes. In these coming 12 years, household consumption in Africa is expected to reach 2.5 trillion US dollars, more than double the 1.1 trillion US dollars of 2015. Combined consumer and business spending will total up to 6.7 trillion. Implementing this African Continental Free Trade Agreement constitutes a foundation for mobilizing these market opportunities. In the context where we are discussing these aspects today, diplomacy should focus on how the continent can build a competitive, sustainable, agricultural-led, clean energy, power agro-industrial sector that will leverage these markets as fuel towards inclusive wealth creation and climate-resilient building to forestall the desperate lack that drives strife and conflict in the entire continent. Distinguished young diplomats, no problem of human making is beyond humans to solve. Building these strategic foundations to diplomacy may not be a walk in the park, but always be reminded that even the biggest cock that crews the largest was just once an egg. But let us be reminded by a timely African proverb also. Peace is costly, but it is worth the expense. Your effort is surely what the Africa we deserve and the world we deserve today. This paradigm of diplomacy is certainly not beyond you. You have tools within your reach that the youth who have gone or come before you never had. I dare say that the most prominent being at the palm of your hand. I'm talking of the privilege of social media that we have today. I'm talking of the internet-enabled smartphones that you're holding in your hands today. And I'm talking of the internet connectivity that is found nearly in every part of the continent at our disposal. What it means is that in this era of technology, you have the opportunity to be able to do things differently. This brings the world to your palm, literally. And in your hand as we speak today, you have a well of knowledge at your disposal. In your hands as we speak today, you have a well to influence with your knowledge and thoughts. You have a well of partnerships to mobilize and to drive transformational change for people and planet, because that is the DNA of how we can be able to drive inclusive world for each and everyone in the continent. This is an opportunity whereby youth in the 80s or in the 60s, in the 70s, never ever dreamed of. This is an opportunity that you should not miss. Let's start by using it to drive this tenet of diplomacy for climate action and accelerate socio-economic transformation, as has been highlighted. And as we act, let us always remember this, that milk and honey have different colors, but they share the same hearts peacefully. While you may not share the same tribe, while you may not share the same creed or religion, you share a common interest, that of a climate-resilient Africa, creating an inclusive world for all to achieve the essence of diplomacy, ensuring lasting peace in the world. This is how your diplomatic or diplomacy exploit will matter. This is how you will seize the moment and become Africa's now, not just Africa's tomorrow, to truly create the Africa we want as enshrined in African Union Agenda 2063. It is possible. Believe it.